Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you want it, come and get some. Because we love wisdom. Because we love wisdom.
People in every part of the globe are perishing because their judgment is low. From children to teens to elderly folks, this epidemic is incredibly bold. Wisdom is needed to see through the fog. Without it, we'll stumble and cease to the law. You're jumping without something to break and fall if you choose to ignore wisdom's beckoning call. The only people who will lose the war are those who don't know who they're fighting for. You are the only one who can decide your fate. Don't waste your life when you can live inside of grace. If we turn to God and behold His shining face, we will gain traction to run in this human race.
Hey, what's going on? JC Johnson here for the Love of Wisdom, where philosophy meets the streets. And on today's episode, we're going to be discussing the wisdom of Agathism. What's that? More on that after this.
Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you want it, come and get some. Because we love wisdom. Because we love wisdom. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you want it, come and get some. Because we love wisdom. Because we love wisdom.
All right, welcome back. You are listening to For the Love of Wisdom, where philosophy meets the streets. And I'm your host, JC Johnson. And we're on North Coast Underground, where the underground starts with you. Live every Thursday at 4 p.m. And today we're going to be talking about something that may not be familiar to most people, but the idea of it, I think, is pretty familiar. We're going to be talking about Agathism. Now, I'm not talking about Gothics or anything like that, so I'm going to get more specific about what this actually is. But if you're new to the show, you know, this show is all about wisdom, and I'm going to tell you how we got the name of that show. There's a theme that I like to, a theme verse that I like to apply to this show. Is taken from Psalm 90 verse 12 in the Christian Standard Bible. And it says, "Teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts." And just looking at the word philosophy, that's how we get the name of the show, because when you break it down, philo means love, and sophos or sophia, when you look at that original Greek word philosophia, that first part, philo, means love, and sophos or sophia, it means wisdom. When you put the two together, it means love of wisdom. So this show is called For the Love of Wisdom. And wisdom is about making good judgment. It's about having insight about many different things in life and being able to make good decisions as a result. And last time on For the Love of Wisdom, we discussed the wisdom of capitalism, and we actually contrasted that with the wisdom of socialism. So two very different things, and some see these two views as conflicting, but there are really a lot of benefits in both of them. It's not that one is better than the other. And I think that's the problem that a lot of people run into, is they try to decide whether one is better than the other, instead of saying, you know what, I think that both actually have something that we can apply to our lives if we really take the time to understand where different people are coming from. Because nobody has it all correct. You know, nobody can say that their view of life is 100% right, as well-intentioned as they may be. But it was a pretty interesting conversation. We discussed both of those schools of thought over 4 different episodes. And if you missed any of those, you can actually hear them again for free. You can download them today on iTunes, Spotify, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. You can hear it on Google Play Music. And if you have an Amazon Alexa device, you know, you can just say, Alexa, play For the Love of Wisdom. And it'll actually bring that up for you so you can listen to the show hands-free. So go online today, look up For the Love of Wisdom, and you can continue listening on your favorite podcast platform. In those last episodes, snippets of a new song were featured. And this new song is by Johnsonian Theory, and it's called 3 Isms Trilogy, right? And if you don't know about Johnsonian Theory, I'm actually the lead singer and lead guitarist for the band. It's an alternative punk rock band. It does some rap rock as well. Especially in this song, there's some, you can call it rap rock alternative. And This song by Johnsonian Theory is called Three Isms Trilogy, and it just came out on February 4th. You can download the full song on Spotify, Deezer, Apple Music, pretty much anywhere. You can even find it on YouTube, wherever you want. But I would suggest going to Spotify if you have a Spotify account, and even if you don't, they'll still let you listen to the song and download it. All you have to do is just create an account and you can listen to it for free. Also, if you want to join today's conversation, or you even want to contribute to previous conversations, hit me up on Instagram or on Twitter at OnePlanMedia, and in your response, just use the hashtag #ForTheLoveOfWisdom. All right, so today we're discussing the wisdom of Agathism. Okay, so what is Agathism? What is that all about? If we look at the Oxford Dictionary, because this is a word that is not too common, but I think it is something that once I explain it, you'll say, okay, I think that I either agree or disagree, or I've put some thought into this particular school of thought before. Agathism, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is the doctrine that all things ultimately tend towards good, although the means by which this comes about may be evil, unpleasant, or unfortunate. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that good things ultimately will come about, but the way that those good things come may be very difficult. It may be even something that people would consider to be evil. A perfect example of this, I think, is how Israel became a nation. You know, if you're not too familiar with history, I would definitely recommend doing some research, having a better understanding of how the world got into the current state that it's in. Because when you have an understanding of history, you have a better understanding of what's to come in the future. But what happened with Israel, you know, for thousands of years, the children of Israel, people of Israel, have had this promise from God that one day they would have their own nation, that they would inhabit this land. And it seems that for the last few thousand years, people have always tried to destroy them. There was a time in Persia where the Jews, or Israelites, they were living in Persia, and the king of Persia almost had all of the Jews annihilated because of a guy named Haman, who really they should call Hater. Haman the Hater. Haman actually, you know, told the king that he wanted all the Jews destroyed because he had a bad interaction with one of the Jews named Mordecai, and he wanted all the Jews killed. So the king almost went along with this until he found out that his wife, Esther, was actually a Jew. He didn't know that. But as soon as he found that out, and he saw that this guy named Haman was trying to destroy all her people, basically, it put a stop to that. Haman ended up being hanged for that crime, and the Jews were safe. But we've seen that happen plenty of other times, especially I think the one that is the most popular is when Adolf Hitler sought to annihilate all of the Jews in Europe. History just repeating itself, right? It's the same thing happening over and over again. You know, back in the day, you know, way even before the time of the king of Persia and Esther, the Jews were enslaved by the Egyptians for over 400 years. And they went through much hardships, and they were hated. They've been hated for a long time. But basically what I'm saying about that all is that even with them being enslaved, even with people trying to annihilate them, even after going through the Holocaust, the good thing that actually came about after all of that stuff was that Israel, at that point in history, back in the 1940s, it was not yet a recognized nation. But after the horrors of the Holocaust and all of the stuff that was going on, Jews from around the world got the revelation that they needed to come back to their homeland. They needed to come back to the place that they were once scattered away from. They needed to come back to Israel, and thousands and millions of Jews began going back to Israel. And guess what? In 1948, after all these thousands of years, the prophecy was finally fulfilled, and Israel became an official nation, and they are still to this day. So just because something bad happens, it doesn't mean that ultimately it's going to be bad forever. But more on that after this. You're listening to North Coast Underground, where the underground starts with you, JC Johnson, for the love of wisdom, where philosophy meets the streets. Welcome back. You're listening to For the Love of Wisdom, where philosophy meets the streets. JC Johnson here on North Coast Underground, where the underground starts with you. So today we're discussing the wisdom of Agathism. And what is Agathism really all about? Is basically just looking at situations for what they are, acknowledging the good, the bad, all of that, but also saying that you believe that ultimately, in the long run, it's going to lead to something that's good. And the example that was given before the break was just how even the Jewish people during the Holocaust, at other points in history, where people were trying to annihilate them from the face of the earth, even though they went through that horrible and tragic experience and plenty of other experiences, they were still triumphant in the end. It led to something good. Not that what happened to them was good, but good came about as a result. A perfect example, I think, of Agathism is an experience that a guy had by the name of Robert Puff. Not Puff as in P. Diddy, a different Puff, right? Robert Puff, PhD. He wrote an article for Psychology Today about his experience with this whole philosophy, and I think it's good. It's from the Meditation for Modern Life, and here's what Robert had to say. Basically, to make a long story short, he had a situation where he leased a car. And if you've leased a car before, you know that when you lease it, it's only for a set amount of time. So whether that's for a few months or a few years, you're basically renting a vehicle for an extended amount of time. And he rented this vehicle, and with renting a vehicle or leasing a vehicle, they often have stipulations as far as how long or how far you can drive that vehicle, how many miles you can put on it. So he realized that he was reaching the limit as far as how many miles he was able to put on it during that time period. So he and his wife actually switched vehicles, because during her daily commutes, she put way less miles on her car than he was putting on his. So they just swapped. And as it got down to almost the time that it was time to turn the vehicle back in, as Murphy's Law would have it, she got into a car accident. She was backing out of their driveway, and she hit a car, and she ended up having to pay. Not only did they have to pay to fix that other person's car, they also had to pay to get their car fixed, because they had to turn it back in because they were leasing it. So this was a horrible situation, right, on the surface. And he talks about how he could have been angry with his wife. They could have had a huge argument and ended up not being happy about it as a result. But what ended up happening was, instead of choosing not to be happy, they chose to just deal with it. And his wife took the car to the shop, and she gave it to the mechanic. And it seems as though, even though the mechanic was just making small talk, it actually led to something awesome. The mechanic was telling her, most people that lease cars, they end up purchasing the car and then selling it to someone else and making a profit. This is something that they had never considered before. So his wife told, Robert's wife told him about this. And so Robert started to do some research, and he looked, and he actually found that not only could he purchase the car, but that he would be able to purchase it at a value that was far less than what the car was worth. So he decided to go ahead and purchase it. And then he did some research and he looked into some different buyers, and he was able to find someone who bought the car from him, and they actually ended up making a profit. So going into it, initially, it looked like they were at a loss because of all of the damages that they had to pay in order to fix this car. But what ended up really happening, though, was that by that circumstance happening, they were actually able to fare way better in the long run because they made money from this vehicle instead of just spending money on it. Because when you're leasing a vehicle, it's not really much of an investment as far as that actual vehicle itself, because that car is not giving you money back normally, right? But in this circumstance, they were able to sell the car and gain a profit. So things turned around to be far better for them in the end. And one thing that Robert says here, he says, optimism helps us to look at events in a brighter, more positive way. However, the danger of being optimistic is that we often don't sufficiently deal with our feelings. So he was saying here that it's not about being optimistic, because just being optimistic is just saying, oh, I think that everything is fine and everything is going to be fine. There's no problems. So being overly optimistic, it means you're not really looking at the issues. You're not being truthful about the fact that there is a problem. You're maybe trying to protect yourself from that. But he's saying, no, you got to deal with it, because this is a real thing that happened. It's a bad thing that happened. But instead of just staying there and becoming pessimistic and saying, oh, this problem will never be fixed, because that's not good either, he took the Agathism approach, and he said, what I'm going to do now is think about a way to make this situation work for my favor. Even though it's a bad situation now, it doesn't mean it's going to be bad forever. And he could have let that destroy him. He could have taken out his frustrations on his wife, but he was able to deal with his emotions in a healthy way, and it led to something greater than what they had before. They ended up coming out with more money at the end than they had going in. So turned out to be a pretty great investment. He goes on to say this: an agathist is someone who believes that in the long run, even though bad things sometimes happen, everything will eventually work out for the best. And that's a great thing. That's something that I keep in mind as well. Even as I'm doing this broadcast, I had some technical difficulties, and I lost a major part of what I had already done, and I ended up having to backtrack and redo some things, and it was frustrating. Even talking about it right now, it's still a little bit frustrating. But what comes about in the long run, though, sometimes what you say needs to be said in a certain way and at a certain time in order for people to properly receive it. So I try to look at it as, even though it didn't turn out the way that I wanted it to, I think ultimately it turned out the way that it needed to. And that's what it's all about. It's about gaining the proper perspective and knowing that in life, sometimes you get shaken up, and sometimes, things do not work out the way that you think that they should. But just because of that, it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. Maybe there's a reason for that. There's a purpose that's greater than what you can actually imagine in that moment. So definitely a good lesson to be learned from that, from what Robert went through. And it's something that all of us can apply to our lives whenever we're going through something that just seems like it shouldn't be happening. Something as inconvenient as getting into a car accident, or failing a test, or being rejected by that person you're asking out on a date. Whatever the thing is that's happening, you have to remember that if this bad thing is happening, that most likely it's either preventing you from something even worse than that, or it's freeing you up for something that's even greater than that in the future. Either way, we can't sit around worried about why things happen, but instead be proactive and do something positive about it. But more on that after this. You're listening on North Coast Underground, where the underground starts with you, JC Johnson, for the love of wisdom, where philosophy meets the streets.
Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you want it, come and get some. Because we love wisdom. Because we love wisdom. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.